Chapter 2, the judge's sentence. The sharp strike of the rosewood gavel against the marble-sounding block reverberated across the vaulted, Gothic ceiling of the first federal criminal courtroom like a dry gunshot through solemn silence. In light of the foregoing, I hereby find the criminal complaint against the directors of the Southern Chemical Consortium without merit due to an absence of strict proximate causation, ordering the final and irreversible dismissal of the proceedings. Conversely, I sentence the self-confessed whistleblower responsible for the unauthorized disclosure of proprietary corporate data, Dr. Samuel Vansbrand, to 24 years and 8 months of imprisonment in a maximum security facility without the privilege of appeal on bail. Let it be enforced, Judge Marcus Sterling did not raise his eyes to the gallery. He did not need to. At 60 years of age, Sterling was one of the most revered and feared pillars of the national judiciary. His robe of pure woven silk, crafted by ancestral tailors in Bologna, draped over his broad shoulders with an almost ecclesiastical majesty. His hair was a uniform, immaculate silver, trimmed with royal precision. His face, gaunt and pale like ancient vellum, bore deep furrows that spoke not of fatigue, but of an icy, calculated severity honed across 4 decades of dictating the fates of ordinary men. In the front row of the gallery, young chemical engineer Samuel Brand, the man who had sacrificed his career and reputation to expose the criminal dumping of 200 tons of carcinogenic industrial waste into the metropolitan river basin, was seized by 2 federal marshals. Samuel's wife collapsed across the oak bench in racking sobs, clutching their 6-year-old son, while corporate defense counsel, immaculate in lead-gray tailored suits, exchanged subtle, contained glances of triumph. Sterling adjusted his white gold reading glasses and gathered his written ruling. His resting heart rate remained steadily anchored at 62 beats per minute. To Sterling, the courtroom had never been a sacred temple of divine justice or humanist ethics. It was a trading floor of financial liquidity. The law was merely a malleable syntactic code, an intricate labyrinth of hermeneutic loopholes designed so that skilled magistrates could justify any predetermined outcome for the appropriate price. Walking with slow, measured strides through the private corridor reserved for appellate judges, Sterling entered his private judicial chambers. The suite was a sanctuary of classical power, 14-foot bookshelves lined with calfskin-bound folios of Justinian's Digest and ancient legal commentaries, French tapestries absorbing all exterior sound, a hand-carved stone hearth where a soft controlled flame burned with dignified warmth. Upon his mahogany desk, a Swiss engineer's satellite phone vibrated once. Sterling unlocked the encrypted display with his fingerprint. A self-destructing text message rendered in hexadecimal code was deciphered upon the screen. Operation Charing confirmed. Deposit of 10,500,000 Swiss francs credited to numbered account in Geneva, Orient Trust. The long-term lease agreement for the vineyard estate in Tuscany has been executed in your name. We extend our deepest gratitude for your technical rigor and expediency. Sterling drew in a long, measured breath, savoring the climate-controlled air scented with cedar essence. 10.5 million. More than enough to ensure that his mandatory retirement, scheduled for 5 years hence, would be spent among the sun-drenched rolling hills of Florence and the private yachts of the French Riviera, far from the rancid, insolvent decay of the industrial towns he had just condemned to slow generational poisoning. The side door clicked open. Lucas, his trusted personal driver and security specialist of 15 years, stepped inside with rain dripping from his heavy waterproof coat. Your Honor, the armored motorcade is staged in the judicial private bay. The storm is worsening, and environmentalist demonstrators have gathered at the main avenue gates, but the subterranean northern tunnel route is completely clear. Demonstrators, Sterling sneered, slipping into his black cashmere overcoat and securing his Italian leather briefcase. The background noise of the impotent Lucas. Men who shape history understand that order demands a price. Let us depart. I have a dinner engagement at 10 with the Chief Justice of the Appellate Court. Sterling's armored Mercedes, Maybach, glided across the rain-slicked asphalt with the hydrodynamic poise of a luxury submarine. The cabin's acoustic isolation neutralized almost entirely the roar of thunder and the rhythmic swish of the heavy-duty windshield wipers. Sterling sat reclined in the rear passenger seat, sipping an aged cognac from a crystal tumbler while scanning European financial market indices on his tablet. The vehicle descended the entry ramp into the Northern Metropolitan Tunnel, a 2-mile subterranean conduit bored deep beneath the historical foundations of the city. As the sedan crossed the first-mile marker, the amber sodium vapor lamps overhead began flickering in a violent, spasmodic pattern. 200 yards ahead, a municipal maintenance flatbed truck swerved across the carriageway and stopped diagonally, sealing all 3 traffic lanes with its emergency beacons extinguished. "What is the meaning of this, Lucas?" Sterling demanded, his voice hardening into courtroom authority. "Engage reverse. Back out to the access ramp immediately." Lucas slammed the transmission into reverse and floored the accelerator. The twin-turbo V12 engine roared, but before the sedan could travel 50 yards backward, a colossal metallic crash shook the subterranean bedrock. A massive hydraulic floodgate dropped from the ceiling behind them, burying tons of reinforced structural steel into the concrete floor and sealing the rear exit. The vehicle was trapped in a tomb of raw concrete. "We're boxed in, sir," Lucas yelled, unholstering his sidearm from the central console. "The engine, it just cut out. The entire electrical bus is dead." The Maybach's digital instrument cluster extinguished in unison. The engine died. The silence that descended within the tunnel was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. From the tunnel's ventilation shafts and through the intake vents of the armored sedan itself, a thick, gray, aromatic vapor began to billow. It carried the same heavy, sweet scent of bitter almonds and freshly generated ozone that had sealed Arthur Vance's fate 24 hours earlier. "Lucas, open the doors! Use the mechanical override!" Sterling roared, the cognac spilling across his wool trousers. Lucas lunged for the manual emergency release lever, but his fingers lost all motor control before touching the steel latch. The security driver slumped forward across the steering wheel, his breathing shallowing into a faint rattle as consciousness abandoned him. Sterling slammed his fists against the reinforced double-glazed side window. The impact of his fists produced nothing more than a dull, useless thud. The dense gas entered his lungs. The first sensation was an icy shock that froze his trachea. Gravity seemed to multiply tenfold. His arms dropped limp at his sides. His peripheral vision was consumed by creeping shadows, and in the rearview mirror, Judge Marcus Sterling watched his dignified visage warp into a mask of primal helpless horror before total darkness swallowed him whole. Waking did not take place beneath the crystal chandeliers of his private study, but within the freezing, rancid humidity of a subterranean abyss. Marcus Sterling opened his eyes with a guttural wheeze. His throat burned with dry fire. The air entering his nostrils was saturated with the pungent stench of oxidized iron, stagnant drainage, and decades of damp concrete dust. He attempted to raise his right hand to adjust his glasses, but the limb refused to obey. Then the physical terror took hold. He was barefoot, stripped of his robe and cashmere overcoat. His 60-year-old body was locked into a monumental chair forged of black cast iron, sculpted with grotesque edges resembling the ribcage of an ancient leviathan. His hands were pinned flat against dark iron armrests. His wrists and fingers held rigid by articulated steel clamps secured with pressure bolts. His ankles were locked into metal brackets anchored into the raw stone floor. His Italian linen shirt was torn across the chest and stained with soot. Where am I?" Sterling croaked, his voice cracking into a raspy whisper. "Help! Is anyone there?" The echo of his voice bounced off the vaulted concrete walls of a cavernous brutalist bunker. 30 feet before him, mounted upon rusted industrial metal racking, a wall of 30 cathode ray tube CRT monitors hummed in unison, emitting the pale, ghostly glow of pure analog static. Shattered glass and dust littered the floor. Overhead, wrought iron structural beams held back tons of subterranean earth, leaking cold water that dripped rhythmically inches from his bare feet. Behind his skull, an electric stepper motor emitted a high-frequency whine. Sterling tried to turn his head to locate the sound, but a padded collar with magnetic locks held his jaw and nape in absolute rigidity, forcing his gaze squarely upon the wall of monitors. The static across all 30 crew screens fell silent at the exact same microsecond. The display shifted into a uniform, deep navy blue. In the center of every picture tube, a luminous sine wave began oscillating gently, pulsing to the rhythm of a subsonic hum that made the bones of Sterling's ribcage vibrate like a bowed cello string. A voice emerged from the speakers embedded within the ceiling beams. There was no theatrical distortion, no cruel mockery. The voice was calm, measured, weighted down by a devastating clinical melancholy, as though every word had been weighed upon the scales of eternal mourning. "Good evening, Your Honor," said the voice of the invisible protagonist. Sterling shuddered. The chill that raced down his spine was colder than the iron of the chair. "Who are you?" the judge stammered, attempting to summon the remnants of his legal authority. "This is the unlawful abduction of a sitting federal judge performing his constitutional duties. Do you grasp the severity of the charges you will face? Aggravated kidnapping, torture, domestic terrorism. If you release me immediately, I can ensure substantial mitigation of your sentence. You speak of the law as though it were your personal shield, Marcus, the voice replied, without the slightest inflection in its mournful cadence. Yet the law you professed in the courtroom this evening was nothing more than a commercial transaction. 10,500,000 Swiss francs credited to the Orion Trust in Geneva, a villa in Tuscany with 60 hectares of vineyards. That was the precise price you set to allow 200 tons of carcinogenic waste to continue flowing into the drinking water of 2 million souls. Sterling felt the color drain entirely from his face. That is a fabricated falsehood. The case was adjudicated strictly on evidentiary grounds and the absence of conclusive toxicological causation. The expert analysis existed, Marcus, the voice countered with terrifying serenity. The 300-page forensic report signed by the Institute of Applied Toxicology was excised from the case files under your direct order last Tuesday under the fraudulent pretext of procedural untimeliness. You sold the lives and futures of thousands of children to secure a sunny retirement in Italy. The creep monitors shifted their displays in unison. The blue light dissolved into a raw documentary gallery of high-definition imagery. On the central screen, clinical photographs of pediatric oncology wards in towns downstream from the contaminated river, where children between the ages of 3 and 9 underwent aggressive chemotherapy for acute leukemias caused by the benzene Sterling had permitted to flow. To the left, the desolate face of Dr. Samuel Brand, shackled in the basement cells of the maximum security penitentiary, his spirit shattered by the injustice of a fabricated conviction. To the right, pristine audio recordings of the telephone conversation in which Sterling negotiated his villa purchase with the chemical cartel's fixer. 10 million is my baseline counsel. To absolve an entire board of directors in an environmental felony of national magnitude, the robe comes at a premium. Wire the funds by Friday, or the matter goes to trial. Look upon the children, Marcus, the mournful voice whispered from the speakers. Do not look away. The man who strikes the gavel must bear witness to the physical execution of his verdict. A sharp mechanical click pierced the bunker's air. Behind Sterling's nape, an articulated arm of forged black iron unfolded with millimeter deliberation. At the arm's terminus, a biomechanical crown bristling with hollow titanium microneedles emerged from the shadows, descending slowly until it hovered fractions of an inch from the base of his skull. The freezing aura radiating from the metal made the hairs on Sterling's neck stand on end. "What is that machine? Get it away from me," he screamed, panic overwhelming his aristocratic composure. "I will return the money. I will resign from the bench tomorrow morning. I will provide wiretaps on 50 other appellate judges involved in kickbacks far larger than mine. I will give you names, bank routing numbers, offshore trusts. Cowardly betrayal to preserve your own skin is not justice, Marcus," the invisible voice declared. "The vanity of your judicial robe was built upon the suffering of innocents who lacked the wealth to purchase your rulings. The forged steel of your corrupt conviction must reach its melting point." The crown nudged forward by a single millimeter. The tips of the first 3 microneedles pierced the dermis at the base of Sterling's neck. It was not merely physical pain. It was a direct bioelectrical discharge into the neural circuits of his limbic system. The judge's brain was flooded with the amplified sensory memories of every unjust conviction he had handed down across 30 years on the bench. Over the next 4 hours, the bunker became the ultimate tribunal of Marcus Sterling's soul. The voice from the monitors read aloud, one by one, the letters of mothers whose sons had been wrongfully imprisoned to protect influential families. It laid bare the autopsy reports of factory laborers who perished without compensation because Sterling accepted corporate junkets. It broadcast the despairing cries of families dispossessed of their ancestral homes through arbitrary injunctions bearing his signature. Sterling initially resisted with legal doctrine, then with frantic financial bribery, then with hysterical threats. Yet the voice never relented. It continued presenting the truth with an implacable, surgical, and sorrowful precision. Near the 5th hour of continuous trial, the magistrate's psychological armor fractured completely. The arrogance that had anchored his identity for 60 years dissolved into dust. For the first time in his life, Marcus Sterling perceived the monster he had become beneath the sacred mantle of the judicial robe. The cumulative guilt of 3 decades of corruption crashed down upon his soul like a black avalanche. The sob that tore from his throat was agonizing, primal, tearing at his chest. He wept uncontrollably, his head bowing forward, his aged body shuddering with spasms of unbearable, authentic moral grief. Tears and mucus washed through his weathered face, dripping down his bare chest and onto the rusted chains. "For the love of God," the judge wept, his voice choked with racking sobs. I was a monster. I sold human lives. I condemned the innocent for filthy money. God, forgive me, please. Samuel Brand, those innocent children, forgive me, I beg of you. In the dark stillness of the bunker, the voice from the monitors received the magistrate's tears without a single note of sadistic triumph. Genuine remorse, the voice of the invisible protagonist declared, is the only sentence capable of restoring the dignity of your existence, Marcus. A fast-acting sedative mist was released gently from the vents of the resonance chair. As Sterling's exhausted consciousness slipped into a deep trance of surrender and relief, the biomechanical crown advanced with surgical precision against the base of his skull. The dozens of hollow microneedles penetrated the subcutaneous tissue of his nape, seating themselves perfectly between cervical vertebrae C1 and C2. There was no arterial hemorrhage, no crude surgical sutures. Through the microscopic conduits of the needles, the synthetic organism of the iron link was infused into the neural pathways of his brainstem. The synthetic proteins and conductive self-replicating polymers were absorbed seamlessly into Sterling's neural architecture, weaving an invisible biolattice that bound irrevocably to his cerebral synapses. Deep within the chemical trance, Marcus Sterling experienced a surreal internal vision. He found himself standing in the center of an ash-covered wasteland, holding his rosewood gavel. Suddenly, the gavel crumbled into fine black dust between his fingers. From the ash arose thick, thorny roots of black iron and chains forged of dense smoke, wrapping around his legs and embracing his brain in a firm, painless grip. The chains pulsed with a serene, harmonic frequency, tethering his thoughts to a living network of supreme discipline and absolute moral clarity. Sterling understood that the robe he had worn all his life was an illusion. True justice now resided within his very flesh. Marcus Sterling awoke to the gentle warmth of the morning sun touching his eyelids. He was seated in his high-backed leather armchair behind the massive mahogany desk in his courthouse chambers. His suit was immaculate. His cashmere overcoat rested neatly folded on a velvet sofa, and the porcelain coffee cup upon his desk still sent up a thin wisp of aromatic steam. There was no soot, no chains, no trace of a break-in. The magistrate sat motionless for several moments, feeling the calm, measured cadence of his own breathing. He rose slowly and walked into his private marble bathroom. He illuminated the vanity lights and looked upon his reflection in the crystal mirror. His aristocratic features remained unchanged, yet the predatory coldness in his eyes had vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, solemn, and unshakable serenity. With trembling fingertips, Sterling pulled back the starched collar of his shirt and touched the nape of his neck. Beneath the skin he felt a minute puncture mark, smaller than a pinprick, completely invisible to the eye, yet humming with a subtle, living pulse beneath his touch. At that exact instant, with crystalline clarity and without the aid of any physical device, the voice of the invisible protagonist resonated with gentle authority directly within his brain. "Good morning, Marcus. From this day forward, your judicial intellect and your authority on the bench shall no longer serve the marketplace of corruption. They shall serve the protection of the innocent and the cause of peace." Judge Marcus Sterling closed his eyes. A single pure tear traced down his cheek, falling silently into the marble basin. He bowed his head in willing absolute submission. "I understand, my architect," the judge whispered into the omnipresent mind within his skull. "The court now belongs to the truth." The second link of the iron chain was forged.